welcome everyone to our Boardroom Bites at 9 this morning. Our topic for today is crisis leadership versus leadership crisis. And our speaker today is Dr. Claudelle von Eck. Claudelle is the former CEO of the Institute of Internal Auditors, and she's the founder of Brave Inflexions. She is a strategic advisor, an executive coach, a facilitator, trainer, and a keynote speaker, as well as an IODSA certified director. Claudelle, I'm going to hand over to you now, and I will see everyone back again during the Q&A session.
Thank you very much, Vicky, and good morning to everybody, wherever you are in the country. It is really an honor for me to be able to spend some time with you this morning. Thank you to the IOD for this opportunity. Leadership is one of my absolute favorite topics. It's one of those things that I believe we often misunderstand. We tend to think that when somebody is in a leadership position, that the person is necessarily exercising leadership. So leadership for me is a doing word. It is about understanding that it requires certain actions. It's not just something that is handed over to you. One needs to earn the ability to say that I am exercising leadership. So today I'm going to talk about leadership through two lenses. I'm going to talk about crisis leadership. What are the kinds of things that one should be expecting to see leaders do when a crisis hits? And I am looking at it beyond the current crisis, although the current crisis is a wonderful opportunity for us to see leadership in action, and I think a lot of lessons are being learned now. But think about it much broader. So a lot of different crises can hit a company. For example, an ethics crisis. So I'd say if there's been a significant ethics failure in the organization and a scandal is blasted all over the news, that would put the organization in a significant amount of crisis. And then I'm going to talk about what are the kinds of things that tend to stand in our way in exercising good leadership during a crisis. The first thing that I just want to mention is that we need to find the eye in the storm. And this is good. It sounds like a very simple concept, but in practice, my observation has been that a lot of people find it very difficult to do this. Either personality stands in the way or past baggage stands in the way, but your ability to center yourself is crucial if one is going to lead the organization through a crisis. Now, I know some of you are coming in as non-executive directors, some of you as executive directors, so you kind of need to look at it from both perspectives. If you're non-executive director, one of the questions that you should be asking is, when we're looking at the executive, do we have a sense that they have found the eye of the storm? Because when you're in the eye of the storm, and you've been able to center yourself and press the silence button and on the noise around you, it becomes a lot easier to see what is really going on. Because sometimes we stay ourselves blind against what is standing immediately in front of us, but we don't see the root issues that stand behind it. So the calmer you are, the more, the easier it becomes to see. So it's the centering yourself is at an individual level as a leadership, but it is also at the collective level. When you're looking at the board, is the board centered? And is the board sitting in the eye of the storm to make sure that the steering is happening as the way it should be happening, right? The other thing is becoming comfortable with uncertainty being a friend. That is going to be, in my view, definitely going forward, it is going to be a skill that all of us need to acquire. And you can see now as we're going through this pandemic, one of the most difficult things for us to deal with is the uncertainty, this inability to say to your people, this is how things are going to pan out. This is how long this is the situation is going to last. This is exactly how we're going to come out of the crisis. As leaders, we no longer have the ability to to create certainty for people, right? So, but you can't, you first need to become comfortable with uncertainty yourself before you can lead the people through the uncertainty. The other concept that I think is very important is loading up on empathy. And here, I'm not talking about sympathy, and we use the term empathy very loosely, but when you're looking for the evidence thereof, it often is missing. Empathy for me is your ability to see through the eyes of others and understand their reality. A mistake that we often make as leaders is to think that how we experiencing the crisis, the way we see the reality pan out, is exactly how everybody else is experiencing it. So almost think about it in terms of there are parallel universes running in the organization, and one needs to be able to see through the different eyes so that you can have an integrated approach and a view that is consolidated, that says this is the actual reality of the organization, not just the reality as perceived by one individual within the organization or just the board. Also, very importantly, is to get people focused on the purpose. And so when we're in the crisis, people deal with the crisis very differently. And this is also part of why empathy is important, is to understand that with different personality types, people are going to react very differently. Some are going to be able to run faster than others in terms of getting up and dealing with the crisis, and others are going to deal with it a lot slower. But the one thing that makes it a lot easier to steer everybody together in the same direction is to get people focused on the purpose. And once again, sounds like a simple thing, but you don't always see it in action. So there has to be, you know, as we find the eye of the storm and we're centering ourselves, one of the questions that we should ask is, does everybody understand the purpose the way we understand it? And do we have everybody focused on it? Be honest and acknowledge legitimate fears. And a mistake that leaders often make is to try and sugarcoat things, or to say to people that what you're afraid of is not really, it's you being irrational in your fear. And that just worsens things. So as a leader, being able to acknowledge, be honest about it, but at the same time also being able to allay irrational fears. And understand what those are. So if one knows where people's thinking is, and you're able to see through their lens with empathy, one can see where the fears are and be able to allay those fears. Also very important is to keep an eye on where you are in the storm. So I'll take Wells Fargo as an example. What started off, what seemed to be there was the corruption that was exposed, and I'm not going to go into the whole story because I don't really have much time, but essentially in monetary terms, if you quantify it, it wasn't really as big a scandal. But if you look at what happened to the bank within that period, and we're now talking back to where the whole thing erupted around 2016, the ripple effect, really there was one ripple that hit the organization after another. So what was seemingly a thing that they would be able to get under control very quickly snowballed. Right, so one storm may have multiple facets to it. So we need to be able to say, this is where we are in the storm, and be able to look back and see whether there are other ripples that may come as a consequence. In the current pandemic, of course, if the organization is only looking at it from the perspective of we're wanting to get out of lockdown and we'll get back to normal, then it may be fooling itself, right? So we know that the possibility is there that we may have a second wave. We don't know how long the virus is going to be with us without a vaccine that's really working. We'll see what Russia's vaccine is going to do for us, but there may be ripples, and when you think you're through the storm, there may be others. So to keep a clear head around that. So from a board perspective, oversight, important, but from a multidimensional view perspective, right? So it's hindsight, insight, and foresight. And the conversation needs to be around who is providing us with the hindsight, who's providing us with the insight, who's providing us with the foresight. So in terms of hindsight, if we just think about the previous slide that I showed you, the multiple storms, what are the lessons that we have learned? Do we understand the patterns that have led to where we are? So what created the crisis, especially when the crisis was ignited within the organization? Have we identified the gaps, and have the gaps been closed? Insight in terms of what is the current situation? Do we have a good understanding in terms of exactly what is playing out in dashboard and regular reporting? Very important, but who is providing us with that insight and assurance around the fact that we've been dealing with it? Have we identified the weaknesses, and are they addressed? Then foresight. And this is the ability to see around, you know, the environmental scan that we need to do constantly. And often when we're in a crisis, we tend to forget to do these things. So we need to ask ourselves, who is keeping us on track in terms of sight? So I always say you need to have vision, and for me, vision is not just a vision statement that sits somewhere on a shelf. And if we had to ask the board members individually, so can you please quote the vision of the organization? And most of us need to think about it. But vision is your ability to see, and your ability to take a step back, and that brutal honesty with self as a leader, and asking that question, am I doing enough to see? And from an oversight perspective, do we see what's coming through in the hindsight? Do we see what's coming through in the insight? And do we see in terms of what's coming through in the foresight? And how are we plotting to go forward, right? So in scenario planning, which you're all very familiar with, very important, and we talk about these things, but if we had to ask a board member at any given point in time, what are the kinds of scenarios that that you believe may play out? And do you think that the organization is ready if any of those any of those scenarios play out? And it's important, of course, to look at it from the different dimensions, which include your people and culture. So a question, and I'll touch on it a little later again, that a lot of organizations should be asking now is, with people having worked from home, and that created a significant disruption for the organization, and as we're bringing them back, how has that shifted our culture? And those shifts that are happening in the culture, are they positive or are they negative? And if they are negative shifts, if we anticipate that there may be negative shifts as a result of this fact that we've actually gone into a sort of diaspora, what are the things that we need to do to counteract that, to bring us back to equilibrium, to where we need to be? The strategy and the business model, do we need to revise that? Do we need to go back and change things as we see the various scenarios playing out? Processes and structures, if any one of those scenarios play out, would we have the right processes and structures in place to deal with that scenario? The same with the infrastructure and technology, financial models that would need to be reworked, your customers and suppliers. So some of the key questions that we should be asking is taking a very deep dive where both our customers and suppliers are at point in time, but look at it in multiple layers. So if one looks from the supplier perspective, not just my immediate supplier, but the supplier of my supplier. What is happening there? Do we have a potential crisis that may be developing there, because suddenly the distribution channel may be disrupted significantly, and are we ready for that? And of course, all our other stakeholders. I've just taken a few of the things that I think are important for us to think about in terms of each one of those different scenarios that could play out, and whether we are in a state of readiness to be able to deal with each one of those scenarios from all of these different perspectives. So board members should be asking whether the executive is keeping its eye on all of these. very importantly, what one would also see in a crisis, in terms of when you see leadership being exercised in a crisis, is leading with confidence, but not, of course, not from a know-it-all perspective. And that basically means creating focus on finding solutions. So one can very confidently lead the team, use the energy that is being created by the crisis, because crisis has a wonderful way of creating energy. So the analogy that I like to use is when you are, if you're standing in front of a high fence and somebody asks you to jump the fence, you may look at this fence and think there's no way in hell. Now, if they let loose a bull terrier and that thing comes running, you're going to jump the fence, right? So that energy that's created by that crisis, if we use it effectively, we can help the people to start to focus, right? So organizing, directing people to get to a solution. But it's a very fine balancing act. So you can either, and this is where we sit at an inflection point, you can either use that energy positively, or if it's not harnessed properly, it can create a very negative disruption within the organization. Probing and experimenting is what you would want to see, and this is like probing in terms of all the different dots. If we see the dots around us, connecting the dots, and you can't always see the full picture at the beginning. So little probes, and not getting to a point where we think we have now decided this is what the picture is going to look like. So if one looks at the current situation, there's a friend of mine. We constantly have debates around where we are with the virus and so forth. And the one thing that I've observed is between the two of us, the one had very quickly come to a conclusion that this is that person is a denialist. This is the situation, and the government is just messing with us, and there's a whole lot of conspiracies going on at the same time, and that's it. On the other hand, there is this is a new thing, we don't know yet, and we need to keep an eye on how things are playing out, and not make up our minds immediately. And here personality tends to come into play as well. So if your personality profile is one where you would look at the options on the table, decide on an option, and then run with that option, and that's it. That's what we run with, and not build flexibility in it. And you're sitting at the top, your personality is often mirrored within the organization. And so being able to constantly probe and experiment is keeping an open mind and not getting to a sense of certainty. Remember, uncertainty, making that our friend. Rapid problem solving and innovation. I'm not going to go too deeply into that, but that is part of what one would want to see in leadership and leading through a crisis. And of course, being very visible. I think one of the mistakes that leaders often make in a crisis is we go into the boardroom and we forget that there are stakeholders out there that are finding it very difficult to deal with the uncertainty. Good leadership in a crisis is visible. People can see that it's being led with confidence, even if we say to people, we don't have the answers. People don't always expect leaders to have the answers, but what they expect leaders to do is to be leading in the front, being visible, and being able to provide answers and communicate on a constant level. So when we say communication is key, one needs to tie this together with the empathy that I talked about earlier on, your ability to see through the different lenses, the different realities, being able to identify all the stakeholders, and making sure that when we communicate, we do it in such a way that people actually understand what it is that we're saying and where we want to go. And make sure that there are feedback loops in the system to test whether that communication has been successful. Key, of course, is transparency and honesty. One often sees in a crisis, especially when it is a crisis that was ignited within the organization, that the leadership tend to then want to go into protection mode and not being transparent and honest. I see hands going up, so I'm going to take the questions once we've gone through all the slides. So if you can just hold your question or just type it in the Q&A for Vicky to pick up. Right, and of course also own your narrative. If you're not very clear in where and how you're dealing with the situation, others are going to create the narrative around you for you. So we need to rethink a lot of things, such as the value proposition may need to adapt on its feet. And so are we asking the question when we're in the crisis, or we're going through the crisis, is our value proposition being affected by this, and do we need to adapt it? Do we need to forge new collaborations? When we're in the crisis and we're sitting like now in a global crisis, for example, where others are going through the same, we need to start thinking about if others are going through more or less the same thing, can we start to work together in certain areas so that we can harness the energy together, but also move away from duplication of effort. So if we look at the current crisis, for example, everybody's trying to find solutions and very little cross-organizational conversations about how can we work together to get through the crisis, because this is now a national, for us here in South Africa, a national crisis. How do we work together so that we can spread the workload across organizations as opposed to us working in silos? And so if we're starting to think about it at a macro level and thinking in an integrated manner, the forging of collaborations is when we're talking about we're now really leading in the crisis. Right? Of course, also be prepared to fail and allow the team to fail, because we can't see. We can't, in the uncertainty, we can't see very far. We're connecting the dots as we're going along. We're sending out probes and so forth. And here specifically, as board members, especially as the non-executive board members, we should ask the question whether in leading the people, in leading the organization, the executive is allowing enough space for that probing and experimenting to happen, and allowing a climate where people feel safe, that they actually can fail. Because if we don't have that, and we don't ask very deep questions about whether we've created that, we can very easily paralyze people. And the solutions may be sitting in the minds of people that feel too afraid to speak up because they are worried about how the organization or leadership will react. Also being prepared to make difficult decisions and be misunderstood in the short term. So as we're connecting the dots, and we're starting to see a picture emerging, that means that in some cases we're going to have to deliver bad news. Those difficult conversations need to happen amongst the leadership as quickly as possible. And then we need to be able to understand that as we're putting things in motion, that there would be a period of time that we may be misunderstood, even if we're communicating clearly. And that normally is in the short term. And as people then start to see the results coming through, then things start to tend to settle. But sometimes leaders tend to be afraid of making making those difficult decisions and being misunderstood because we want to be liked by everybody. So leadership and exercising leadership is not being liked by everybody. It is about making sure that we come out of this thing okay, right? And then ask the question around, what in our culture is hindering us from being agile? So if we're saying that the value proposition needs to adapt on its feet, there's an African saying that says, when the drum beat changes, the dance step must adapt. So as the rhythm changes around us, as the drum beat changes, does the organization have the ability to very quickly change the dance step? So what are those things that are hindering us from being agile within our culture? And then lastly, what we want to see in terms of good leadership in a crisis is your ability to divide the work, being able to see who is taking responsibility for what, right? So now I've talked about it within the context of the country. So now talking about it within the context of the organization. So as we're trying to navigate through the maze, because it is a maze, and I refer these days to a maze with moving walls. So just as you think you figure it out, then you're thrown with another curveball. But as we're navigating through the maze, who's planning the navigation so that we can keep business as usual where business as usual need to be kept, right? And this is now not referring to where we need to change tact or need to change our dance step, but those critical core aspects of the business that needs to keep running. Who's responsible for that? So who's leading the battle in the trenches in terms of how we're dealing with the crisis? Who is making sure that we take care of the wounded, because it's inevitable in a lot of crises that there would be casualties in the process. Who's making sure that we don't leave anybody behind, right? So currently, for example, with the crisis that we've gone through, well, that we're still going through, we don't quite know where we're at within it. So we're now sitting in lockdown level 2. Things are going to change, but we don't know whether it's going to create a second wave. So with people sitting and working from home, we have less sight in terms of direct sight in terms of where they're at. We don't always know where they are. And sometimes what happens is when leaders are so involved in the crisis, they forget that with the people working from home, they're now working in different realities. And what does that mean? There are people who, and we've already heard stories about an escalation in gender-based violence. We've heard about the escalation in suicides. The suicide rate has gone up, and we're probably going to see the divorce rate going up as if other countries, what has happened in other countries is any indication. So I've seen articles in China, for example, when they came out of lockdown, the divorce rate went up. Now, these are all things that may be part of people's personal lives, but it affects the productivity within the organization. Do we have who keeps in touch with the troops, who makes sure that the stakeholders are informed? And as I said earlier on, transparency is key, being open and honest about it, and gathering the real intelligence, and that the real-time intelligence, and that is where are the dots playing out and how are we connecting those dots, but also very importantly, looking for the opportunities, because there's been lots of opportunities that we've seen in the last few months. How are we harnessing that, and how are we making sure that we have an adjusted strategy for what will be the new normal? So let me quickly look at when we're talking about leadership in crisis, what are the underlying conditions? And very much like what we have seen with the virus, it has the people with underlying conditions were the people who were most vulnerable. So we know now that if you have high blood pressure, for example, or diabetes, you are at greater risk where the virus is concerned. So what are the kinds of high blood pressure, diabetes issues that may be sitting within an organization? Unethical culture. Ethical organization's culture is not at the level where it needs to be in terms of ethics. That is an underlying condition that very well may cause the organization to sink when there is a significant crisis. And here, I think that just in terms of my observation, board members not necessarily having enough conversations around, are we ensuring that we have an ethical culture within the organization? Too many organizations are happy to tick the boxes, right? So we're putting people through ethics training, tick. We have a hotline, tick. And normally that is kind of where it ends. And not enough conversations around what are the kinds of ethical dilemmas this organization may face, for as an example. What are the interventions that we've put in place to ensure that we are building an ethical culture? For board members, are we getting assurance? And so you should be asking whether internal audit, for example, has brought in the giving you assurance around the council, auditing the culture and giving you assurance around that as part of the audit plan. And this is an area that people tend to shy away from because it's those soft kind of issues, and a lot of people don't really. So it's about the organizational behavior that plays out within the organization. How do you look at all those markers? And so I look at culture from 6 different dimensions, and leadership being one of them. And often we find that there's a shying away from auditing leadership. And when I say leadership, it's not auditing individuals, but essentially how leadership is exercised in this organization. And is it appropriate for our organization? And is it encouraging an ethical organization? Is there a climate of fear in the organization? And not enough conversation taking place around this. Sometimes you find that whistleblowers have brought something to even board members, and there is inaction. So if the climate of fear is not addressed, when a crisis hit, the organization would seriously be in crisis, and that underlying condition would just make it, amplify it and make it so much worse. Whether the structure and resources not being, when it's not fit for purpose, you tend to find that leadership can find itself in crisis. Lack of agility, and I've spoken about your ability to adapt, but adapting from the perspective of the people, the leadership, the flexibility within the leadership, the structure within the organization, the way we operate within the organization. If there's lack of agility, when a crisis hits, people are like a deer with headlights and not able to deal with the situation appropriately. Where the leadership is not willing to deal with elephants in the room, and all organizations have elephants in the room, but a lot of organizations tend to not deal with them. And those elephants in the room are often the reasons why crises are amplified, or they themselves may be the ignition of the crisis within the organization. Leadership not dealing with conflict, and Wells Fargo is one of those that is a really good example where the CEO wasn't really the kind of person who liked to deal with conflict. So when issues was brought to his attention, would not really deal with it, avoid dealing with it because he doesn't like to deal with conflict. But those are the kinds of things that could quite easily escalate into a crisis or amplify a crisis. Leadership being isolated from reality, and this comes back to what I was talking about, your ability, and this is a real skill, to get to a point where you realize that what you see is not the ultimate reality. That doesn't matter how intelligent you are, you don't have the ability to process the reality in its fullest context unless you are able to step outside of yourself and allow space for other people's realities to come to the fore so that you can have a consolidated view, right? So if you're isolated from the reality that's playing out, that is where leadership finds itself in crisis. And then, of course, a disconnect between the tone at the top and the walk in the middle. Lots of studies have shown that there is often a disconnect, and I know the Institute of Internal Auditors produces the Corporate Governance Index every year, and that is a survey that is done amongst heads of internal auditors, chief audit executives, and one of the things that you can see very clearly if you look at the reports over the years is that when you're looking at the ethical culture and you look at the tone at the top and how those two are rated, there's a disconnect. So what it says is that sometimes what happens is board members and even executives think that they are saying the right things, they are doing the right things in terms of their own behavioral patterns, but not doing enough to see that it is entrenched, and then looking at feedback loops within the organization to test whether the walk in the middle matches the tone at the top. The tone at the top is not enough. You actually need to check whether it is filtering down throughout the organization. And of course, leadership in crisis is also an indicator often of incompetence. And here, incompetence is not just about your technical skill. I think the age that we're in now, we've got to talk much broader about the skills that are needed by leaders, and what it is, and some of the things I've mentioned in the previous slides. What adds fuel to the fire, often in the crisis, is denial about the scope or the impact of the crisis, and we're once again use Wells Fargo as an example. You know, so you see this thing, you quantify it in monetary terms, and you think because it doesn't involve a hell of a lot of money, not exactly seeing the full scope of the crisis, and understanding that you can't just look at it from this perspective of this is how much money is involved, that one actually needs to go to the root cause and ask the questions around what has caused this. So in the Wells Fargo case, and what they found in the investigation afterwards, is that the corruption was not really so much a result of people wanting to pocket more money, but they were afraid of what would happen to them if they weren't meeting the targets, and being exposed and not being able to meet the targets. The leadership team not dancing to the same rhythm, and you often see this. If there's conflict in the leadership team, it just adds fuel to the fire. And this is where board members have to ask the question, do we have a team, an executive team that is dancing to the same, are they hearing the same rhythm, or are they dancing to different rhythms? Self-interest, we know that is a huge issue. We can see it at a national level in the country as well, trumping the interests of the organization, and that often plays out. And so the higher you go in the organization, often the more you find that there are egos and self-interest at play, and we should be able to have very open conversations around these are the kinds of things that are the elephants in the room that we don't talk about. Thinking that those with the halo effect have the answers and not looking through different lenses. I've spoken about that. And unwillingness to change. So there's your ability to change, and then your willingness to change. If we still want to hold on to past practices, and here we have to be very, very careful, especially when you have people in executive positions who have built the organization from a much diminished version to where it is now. And they become very invested in their babies. So if this is my baby, I may be very unwilling to change, when it means that I've got to deconstruct, destruct, and reconstruct in some cases. Not taking responsibility, going into self-protection mode, is something that we often see in organizations. We don't want the world to see our dirty laundry, so we don't take responsibility for, and also not taking responsibility for the ripple into society. So inevitably, understanding that the organization is a corporate citizen also means that when we are in a crisis, especially when it's ignited within the organization, and that affects society, that we need to take responsibility for that, because that affects the reputation of the organization. And then being willing to open the wound and clean it. I always say the only way to get healing is to open the wound and clean it, and also making sure that there are consequences where the crisis was ignited internally. We still see too many, and we've got to, and sometimes we've got this tendency of looking at the political leadership, and we wanting to see consequences, but we don't look at what is happening in our own organizations, in the private sector, in terms of lack of consequences when it comes to senior leadership. So in closing, let me leave these thoughts with you. A key question when we go through a crisis that we need to ask is, what will we take into the future post the crisis? What will you be remembered for after the crisis? How we react in the crisis, how we respond in the crisis, what we do whilst we're going through the crisis is what we're going to be remembered for. So if we showed empathy, we took responsibility, and we were transparent, the chances that we will be able to bounce back and rebuild is much higher than when we were in a self-protection mode and we didn't want to take responsibility. What shifts are taking place in the culture of the organization, as I mentioned, but this is a conscious conversation, and it's a deep conversation, and really asking the hard and difficult questions, and then continually asking ourselves, are we addressing the lessons that we've learned? We forget so quickly. If one looks at history, if you look back over history and all the crises that we've had, so if you take the auditing culture, the auditing profession, for example, and I'm specifically now referring to external audit, some of the scandals that we've seen now, so if you look at the case in Germany, as it Cardwide or Wirecard, I always get confused with that name, but EY is in trouble now. But if you go back and say, but hang on, these kind of mistakes have been made before. Why are we not learning? And that's a question that we should be asking at board level, asking these very pertinent questions. What will we be remembered for after the crisis? What shifts are taking place in the culture of the organization, and is it moving in a positive direction, or are we finding ourselves in trouble? And are we addressing the lessons that we've learned? Vicky, I am done. I know that I've gone very fast. It's quite a bit of ground that I needed to cover. So I'll open for questions. So I know that I've seen some hands that were raised. I don't know if you want to take those first, Vicky, or how you want to play it.
Let's do the hand that's raised while I look through some of the Q&A.
Okay.
Lungisa, if you can unmute your mic, you can speak. I see a few more hands have come up as well. Lungisa, just please unmute your mic and you'll be able to talk. It doesn't seem to be working, so I'm gonna ask John. If you unmute your mic, you can speak as well. No. Let's give it a few more minutes. So there's a question from Clive, Claudelle. He wants to know, how do you see the authentic self come through in leadership today? Many leaders tend to focus on how they are perceived rather than how they act.
Yeah, thank you, Clive. That's a very good question. And, you know, this is now really speaking to those hard things that we're referring to as the soft issues. You're absolutely right. I think that we lack significantly when it comes to authentic leadership. And a lot of that has got to do with how we have shaped society. And I think here we need to take collective responsibility. And there are so many factors that come into play. So I'll take an example of one of the conversations that we had about a week ago, and I bring it in the context of Women's Month, is that sometimes women tend to forget that they bring a very particular aspect to the table in their feminine leadership, and then what they do is emulate masculinity, because that is what is perceived to be what would bring you success in the organization. And when we do that, we actually rob the organization from the balance that we were supposed to bring to the table. So the first thing for me as a leader is your ability to be brutally honest with yourself and ask yourself, who am I? What is my purpose? And what is it that I bring to the table? What am I supposed to bring to the table? Because each one of us have something different. Right? We don't all bring the same thing to the table. But if I recognize my purpose and I understand the power in what it is that I need to bring to the table, and I then understand what the organization is robbed from if I am not me, the authentic self, and I emulate somebody else and I actually play out somebody else's purpose. Then I think it would be a lot easier. But these are conversations that we need to have very, very, very openly. But it really starts with your ability to look yourself in the mirror and ask yourself, who am I still authentic? And be very, very mindful and careful of not allowing the position to become your identity. I think this is where a lot of leaders go wrong. I've experienced that with myself. I had a personal crisis a number of years ago, and I needed to realize that I had become more the embodiment of the position than Claudelle and Claudelle's purpose and what Claudelle brings to the table. I hope I answered your question, Clive.
Thanks, Claudelle. The next question by Tembisile is, if the board doesn't have a common view, how do we manage this in a manner that doesn't add to the crisis or uncertainty?
Yeah, sure. And Tembe, that's one of those questions that is a really difficult one to deal with, because I think the number one thing in my view that stands in the way is ego. And I don't think that it is something that you can necessarily build overnight, and it's not something that you can build in the crisis. So there has to be a very conscious effort on the part of the board, and here I think the chair of the board needs to play that very significant role in facilitating and leading the board to get to a point where you can have those open conversations and honest conversations that are safe conversations as well about what is it that informs our differences of opinion, and how can we use that to harness, that diversity of thought, how do we use that to harness, how do we harness that and to take the organization to a better place, as opposed to it being becoming destructive. Because that is what you want to avoid. You don't want to get the board into an echo chamber where everybody thinks the same and everybody has exactly the same view. But you do want to get the board to a point where it is able to work through the different views and then come to a point where there's a reasonable consensus about which is the best. And often the best is sometimes the lesser of evils, or finding your way around the dilemmas in the process. I hope that helps you, but it really is a concerted effort, and this is where, the boards need to make space in their agenda. So if you have a strategy session, for example, have space in that to have that conversation around how do we collectively utilize our differences to propel us forward.
Thanks, Christelle. An anonymous attendee has asked, how do we divide the work in a crisis when our management team is too small?
Yes. So I think here you need to do a combination of things. The one is, when the management team is too small, one of the things that managers often, or leaders, people in leadership positions, one of the mistakes they often make is to think that they've got to carry everything. And we don't look at the broader team to see who in the rest of the team, and I'm talking about beyond management, or sitting at the different levels within the organization, can take the ball. So one of those things that I asked in terms of dividing the work is, who's looking after the troops? That doesn't have to be somebody in a management position. It just needs to be somebody who has a great deal of empathy that can gather the intelligence and bring it to the leadership team. So think broader and not just the small team. Make a list of all those aspects that you need to focus on and then prioritize. Sometimes we can't get to everything, but here also I think about how you can collaborate. So if one were to let me take an example of an organization that would have a relatively small team, would be the institute Institute of Directors. So the Institute of Directors could have a conversation with the Institute of Risk Management. And it's actually a really good example because they're sitting in the same space. Come together and say, look, we're sitting with with a similar problem. Can we, in terms of our management teams, divide the work? So think much broader, think outside of the box. And don't go, and that is why you need to get to the eye of the storm, because when you're calmer, you can start to see how we can divide the work much more effectively than trying to do everything ourselves at the top.
Thanks, Claudelle. I see Sherma's got a question for us. So Sherma Malan, if you can unmute your mic. It seems for some reason this morning. Oh, there we go.
Yeah.
We can hear you, Sherma.
Yes, thank you so much. First of all, it's actually not a question. I think it's more of a comment. I really enjoyed the session this morning. So I think from my perspective, I wanted to say thank you so much to Claudelle for the session this morning. I do apologize. I was not intending to raise my hand, but while I have the floor, thank you so much. I thought that was a really good session.
Thank you, Sherma. I really appreciate that feedback. And as presenters, when you're speaking to a camera, it's very difficult because you can't see the eyes of the audience to see whether they're following you, whether they're with you, or they're enjoying it. But thank you, I appreciate that.
Claudelle, another question. How do you address an elephant in the room without creating divisions within the leadership of the organization?
Yeah, and that is it is a tricky one. I think and once again here the board needs to play that very important role of ensuring that you create a culture within the organization where there isn't a climate of fear. And that we also create a culture within the organization where we don't have untouchables. Because often those elephants in the room that we don't address is because we have created a scenario where we have untouchables in the organization. So to have that constant conversation is very, very important. Secondly, I think in terms of addressing the elephant in the room, once again, if you address things with empathy, it makes it so much easier, and it makes it so much more palatable for people to take the feedback and to deal with it, right? So if you're going to address the elephant in the room, understand who will be affected and how they will be affected. The big one, of course, that I think is often the most difficult to deal with is the egos, right? So sometimes it's in terms of how you frame it and how you bring it to the fore would really determine whether people's defenses are going to go up or whether you're going to be able to disarm them from those defenses and actually have the conversation. But it is, I think, the most important for me is to do it with empathy, to think upfront about how they will be affected and to address it. So if I'm going to address, Vicky, sorry, I'm going to pick on you. If your behavioral patterns is the elephant in the room, I need to start to look at, if I'm going to address this with Vicky, potentially how is she going to feel about what would be taken away from her? Why is that so important? And then address the root cause, as opposed to just telling people we don't like this, because then what happens is the fences go up and then people start to act out. My experience is just that it's about how you deal with it. And if you deal with it sensibly and make people feel like you see them, that you understand their battles as well, makes it a lot easier.
I think that's very true, Claudelle. There's two questions from Robin and Dumasani around audits. Robin wants to know, how do you audit a culture or even leadership? And Dumasani says, if you had to audit crisis leadership, what would be the key focus areas?
Right, so I think when we're looking at auditing cultures, it's one of those things that is a lot easier than people think it is. It is really about understanding what are the behavioral patterns that you would expect to see in an ethical culture and looking for those, but you would also look at your policies. You would look at things like and asking the questions, right, in terms of, do people feel that they are able to speak up in the organization without fearing that they're going to be victimized? You look at your exit interviews, what's coming through, and that you're looking at things like whether leaders have been trained and managers have been trained on how to deal with whistleblowers, because that is often where things go wrong. So there's a number of things that you would look at. So our work, as I said earlier, I work on 6 dimensions, and each one of those dimensions has got layers under them, and you just need to know what you need to look for. So my advice for internal auditors who may not have been trained in that area is to look at behavioral specialists, to bring those in. And when it comes to the leadership, sometimes in auditing the leadership, sometimes it's better to co-source, to bring somebody in from outside, because just my observation over the years is that, especially when internal audit is in-house, sometimes there is this fear that if I raise these findings, that there will be a backlash from the leadership. But to start to socialize the idea at board level, at executive level, that what we want is to see a clear picture so that we can adjust into and make things right, and create that. Of course, you know, my gray hair is real, right? The second part of the question was, can you just repeat that for me, Vicky, the second question?
It was, if you had to audit crisis leadership, what could be the key focus areas?
Yeah, so I think, and I think it's what I've been covering in the presentation. You would look at whether the leadership, first and foremost, are making sure that they have a good understanding of the scope of the crisis, and in terms of how it may affect the organization, whether there are activities that are explorative in terms of making sure that we fully understand the full extent of the crisis. You would want to see that the leadership is looking at the people side, because that is often where things go horribly wrong. You know, you can buy computers and extra laptops and stuff very quickly, but if your people are starting to fall apart, your computers are going to be useless. You want to see that. You would also want to look at whether responsibility, so if the crisis is being ignited internally, how the organization is dealing with it. If there's a lot of secrecy around how the leadership is dealing with it, you've got a problem. So if you look at the country at the moment in terms of where we are, when we started in lockdown, I think most South Africans were very supportive of the action that government has taken, and I think the president had a lot of support behind him. But what happened over time is that besides the fact that there's been a lot of irrational thought around the regulations, or some of the regulations. So some of the regulations were good, but some of the regulations were like completely irrational. But the lack of transparency behind it. So how did you arrive at that conclusion? So the more there is a lack of transparency, the more you would find that there is reputational damage for the organization. So one of the things that you would want to look at is whether there is this openness, whether the organization is taking responsibility for where they are, and especially when they've created the crisis.
Thanks, Claudelle. Von, you've had your hand up for some time. I did say I'll let you speak now. So you can unmute your mic, please. There we go.
Hi, so I actually did send through a morning, everybody. I did send through a question. You know, everything that has been spoken about before this goes back to exactly what I put in my question. If the company has got very clear and openly discussed, openly shown to all of the employees. Very clear business visions, clear strategies, clear operational plans, clear roles for everybody. Everything that we've been speaking about before this becomes null and void, because everybody knows where the company's going. Everybody knows who is going to be doing what. The sacred cows are no longer sacred. Nobody can stand up and say, it's my company and therefore I'm going to make the rules and bugger the rest, because they then become an impediment to the business. And if it's a clearly, if it's an open company, those people should be allowed to leave the business under whatever circumstances, a management buyout or whatever. Any comments from anybody?
Vorna, I absolutely agree with you, and that is the ideal. But more often than not, we find that the ideal doesn't play out, and a lot of the times it's because there isn't this very conscious thought around how do we ensure, so at a board level, how do we ensure that that is actually the reality of the organization? You're absolutely right, Sophie, and that is so when the organization does go into crisis, it becomes a lot easier. But it's also a continual conversation, and making sure that the organization stays on track where that culture is concerned. Because remember, when we employ people, when we bring people into leadership positions, we're bringing them in from society. And people come in with their bad habits that they learned somewhere else. And if we don't arrest those bad habits right at the beginning, these kind of things have a tendency of very easily moving through the organization like a virus, and before you know it, it becomes contagious and you have a problem in the organization. So to take the Wells Fargo example again, if you go back before the scandal hit, Wells Fargo had, if you go, and the investigation has shown this, they had the right governance structures in place. They were saying the right things. They were receiving awards, and they were seen as one of the perfect examples of what that organization should look like and what a culture should look like. And yet, they got hit by the scandal. So it's continual vigilance. And I think the thing that makes that so difficult, Vaughan, for us to get to that point where you actually have real examples of organizations that operate the way you described is because we're dealing with people issues, the human issues that sometimes sits under the surface and are a lot more difficult to identify. And one of the examples that I'll use is if you look at the number of psychopaths that are sitting in top leadership positions, the percentage of psychopaths in top leadership positions is much higher than the general population. And the reason why they're able to get that high is because they're willing to do things that other people are not willing to do, but they're also able to camouflage themselves very well. And they come across as, and they're saying the right things, and it may seem like they're doing the right things. And it's not always that easy to identify them. So there's a paper on my website, I think I titled it "Why Governance Efforts Fail." I'll send it through to the IOD to send to those who participated if you're interested in it. But I talk to a number of things that are really the human issues that gets us into trouble.
Thanks, Claudelle. We've reached 10 o'clock. There is a lot of questions on our Q&A that I haven't managed to get to. Claudelle, do you have maybe time for one more question? I see there's a lot of questions around. I know we've talked about leadership in terms of the executive and management level, and there's some questions around, you've spoken about crisis leadership needing to have agility. And there's some questions around how do you encourage members to co-opt skills when they're required if they are change adverse, or specifically like in the boardroom, if the board chair or the actual shareholders, stifle this robust engagement or aren't willing to look at new ideas that potentially can change the way the business currently is, because they're still stuck in the current way of how things are being done. So I think just as I've kind of merged a couple questions there just to kind of end with something around from a board and shareholder level.
Yeah, and those are one of the elephants in the room, right?
Yeah.
So we're aware of the fact that we have leaders who are change averse. And once again, it's not something that you can really solve in the crisis. This is one of those things that we need to look at over time, that we're building our skills in this area. I think the first thing that is important is to show people the reality of the impact if we don't change, right? And to put it in a manner to them that is palatable to them. So if you're saying to a person, you just don't want to change, what you are going to find is that people's defenses then go up and they are not going to want to change. But then if you bring it in as from a risk perspective and you bring in examples, so you almost need to, I often say you need to trick people sometimes, but you need to help people to get them to a point where the penny drops in their head, especially when they are the ones that are going to make the ultimate decisions, and you've got an ego issue. And sometimes it is also, it's a personality issue as well. I'm a firm believer in the MBTI profiling. I like it a lot because it tells you a lot. It helps you to deal with the different personality types. So if somebody tends to be very set in terms of once we've made a plan and this is the plan and we're going to run with the plan, how do you then deal with that person? Firstly, you've got to acknowledge that that is their reality. And then, as I said earlier on, deal with it with empathy in terms of helping them to strip that down. But more often than not, being able to put the mirror in front of people in a very sensitive manner. Sometimes you need to bring somebody in from outside to facilitate conversations and to bring that mirror in. But importantly, I think, is to help people to understand the consequences. Don't just tell people to change, help them to understand the consequences if we don't go another route.
I think that's a great point to end on, Claudelle. From my side and the IODSA team, thank you so much for giving your time this morning and presenting and sharing some of your wise wisdom and comments and recommendations to our attendees this morning. Claudelle's details are on the screen. We will send everyone the presentation slides as well as the recording for the session and the article that Claudelle mentioned that's on her website. So we will send all of this to you by the end of the week once the recording is ready to be shared. So I hope everyone enjoyed the session. I think from the comments that I've seen, Claudelle, everyone has said that it was really insightful and an eye-opener. So thank you once again, and we will see everyone next week, same time. Thank you.
Thank you.